Thank you. It is an honor to be here with you this morning, and I'm grateful to you, Mayor Nardella, to Ellen Toscano at NYU Florence, and to the Friends of Florence and the organizers of La Pietra Dialogues for your generous invitation and your warm welcome. This morning, I'm conscious that we are a varied audience, and as such, I hope that my talk will give you a general overview through which I might introduce some of the challenges facing the question of cultural heritage today. I'm excited to see that we will have the benefit of learning more in detail about these questions later from a group of prominent legal experts in this field. Let me begin, if I may, with a story from the place where I grew up, a little county called Norfolk in the east of England. These days, Norfolk is a bit of a rural backwater, but in the Middle Ages, it was a major wool-producing region. Bishop's Lynn, now called King's Lynn, was a port of such importance, it was the only Hanseatic town in England, and Norfolk's capital, Norwich, was for a while England's second most important city. This wealth meant that medieval Norfolk was covered in a network of villages and market towns, each of which had a church, over 1,000 of them in total. Some villages even had 2 or 3 churches to their name. In terms of density, there is nothing else like it in Europe north of the Italian Alps. But over time, the wool trade declined. England's economic focus moved west towards the Atlantic Ocean and America, and then north during the Industrial Revolution. The importance of Norwich decreased as cities like Bristol, Liverpool, and Manchester grew. The old ports of Norfolk became home to fishing fleets instead of trading ships. Monasteries and abbeys, which had been attacked during the Reformation, were abandoned. The villages gradually depopulated, and many of them became deserted, some through this process of economic change, and some because of plague. Norwich lost its status, and Norfolk became the sleepy provincial place it is today. But what about all those churches? Out of the 1,000 which existed in the Middle Ages, almost half are now in a state of ruin. Some are missing a tower or a nave. Some are left open to the elements, almost indistinguishable as buildings, while others have disappeared altogether without trace. Many of the settlements which supported these churches have long gone, meaning that the ruins are now in isolated situations, dotted around fields and farmland. This is a photograph taken by the artist John Piper after World War II. And here is an example of a village with 2 medieval churches. Unable to sustain both economically and in terms of a congregation, one of the 2 has been allowed to fall into disrepair. Maintenance of these sites is a headache for the local authorities because they need to be protected as historical artifacts while not serving an obvious purpose which would justify the investment required to preserve them. The question of their preservation isn't as clear as it is with a great cathedral or a castle. These ruins often have no officially recognized value as heritage. These are not famous places like Westminster Abbey or Stonehenge. They are not exceptional items. They are not protected by the state. There are literally hundreds of these sites, a massive inheritance of decrepit buildings in every corner of the landscape. Landscapes change over time. Communities come and go, memories fade. But the buildings still stand. These are not just ruins. They are documents of something which is everywhere around us, but which no longer has clear relevance or function. The question is how to read the document and the heritage contained within it. But on this level, the County of Norfolk still hasn't found an answer. Little is done about these buildings until they are at the point of being pulled down. And even then, even when money and the will is found to preserve them, there isn't a clear sense of why broken objects are worth keeping and what exactly they mean. It is what the philosopher Arthur Danto called a question of historical literacy. I would recommend, he writes, that one think of objects in the present world as comparable to words, and the historical use and understanding of them as comparable to reading. Otherwise, we remain historically illiterate. We do not know what the stones say. Of course, the question is not just how to read these objects, but also what to do with them. What decisions do we make? Or rather, what decisions do you make, if I may speak to you in your capacity as elected city mayors, on behalf of the stone piles that we have inherited? Should we leave these objects as they are to retain their broken authenticity, or should we preserve them as ruins in some kind of artificially maintained state? Or should we reconstruct them according to how we interpret their history? Should we turn them into perfectly made replicas of what they once were? What should be done now, here in Italy, with those ruins left by the terrible earthquakes in places like Amatrice and Norcia in recent months? Prime Minister Renzi has admirably vowed to rebuild every destroyed property in the affected villages. Yet it is important to remember that his response, the decision to restore, is not always replicated elsewhere. To restore or to rebuild, to protect or to maintain, these dilemmas and decisions show us the extent to which heritage is not static. Images and objects are not static. They are dynamic because they force us to enter a debate about what has value for us, about what we choose to protect and preserve, what we consider to be the landscape we want to keep around us, and what we are willing to let fall apart and disappear. And because this debate depends on the decision-making and the choices made by the guardians of these places, it is not just about history or philosophy or archaeology, but it is also about politics, because the decisions we make about the heritage around us are about power. When I first began working on the history of iconoclasm about 15 years ago, it was something of a slightly obscure academic field, a specialism usually associated with religion and art history, particularly with the Protestant Reformation in Northern Europe. It also extended to other episodes in European history, scholars looking at the destruction of art during the French Revolution, or the bombing campaigns of World War II, and the questions of rebuilding razed cities in Germany, or the restoring of churches and mosques in Bosnia after the wars of the 1990s. I don't need to explain to you why September the 11th, 2001 changed the Eurocentric focus of this debate. In the events that followed, through the American-led intervention in Iraq, the destruction of heritage became a hallmark of the sectarianism which exploded across the Middle East. This was not new. Iconoclasm in an area like southern Iraq can be seen as far back as the early 19th century. But it did become an increasingly regular feature in the Western mind, No longer could decisions about broken objects be seen as an obscure or historical concern over old ruins. Instead, broken heritage was becoming front-page news, forcing us to connect our landscape to different countries and cultures from our own. Over the past 2 years, heritage destruction has become one of the major questions facing the Middle East, particularly in areas of Syria and Iraq controlled by so-called Islamic State. Important cultural sites have been hit, only this time not by floods or by earthquakes, but by people attacking images and objects because of their ideology. The ancient city of Nimrud exists no more. Its famous winged statues have had their faces chipped away, and its walls have been detonated. The Parthian city of Hatra has suffered a similar fate. And in Mosul, a place renowned for the wealth and the diversity of its religious heritage, from Christian monasteries to Muslim shrines, the city museum has been smashed up by sledgehammers. When this happened, many commentators responded with astonishment. But for those of us who work on the question of heritage destruction, these events are not surprising. ISIS have followed a pattern, one which builds on a legacy of the same people attacking the same images and objects in the same parts of the world. Let me give you an example. Before their occupation of Mosul in 2014, ISIS attempted to take the Iraqi city of Samarra, famous for its golden domed mosque, a place revered as a shrine by Shiite Muslims. Their attack was repelled by government forces and militia, but it showed that for the iconoclast, history repeats itself. In 2006 and 2007, this same mosque was bombed by the predecessors to Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda also targeted the Shiite shrines of Najaf and Karbala between 2003 and 2007, the latter of which was also a target for so-called Muwahidun, or Wahhabi fighters in the early 19th century. Perhaps most famously, Palmyra has been attacked. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means that it should be given particular protection against the risk of interference and damage. And yet, it fell victim to the Syrian conflict. First, to the pilfering of the regime, and second, to the iconoclasts of Islamic State. ISIS destroyed several of the most important parts of Palmyra, as well as using its theatre to stage the killing of regime troops and the torturing and eventually beheading of its retired head of antiquities. He was over 80 years old. So it is not a coincidence that Syria and Iraq are the target of Islamic State. These are places rich in religious and cultural diversity, among the last truly multicultural corners of the Arab world, and are attacked by those who hate their pluralist identity. The pluralism which has produced paintings and statues, relics and shrines, churches and mosques of Shiite, Sunni, Yazidi, Druze, Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, and Alawite communities, and which has preserved the old temples and figurines of ancient empires like Nimrud, Babylon, and Hatra. When such objects have been attacked, it has usually been at the hands of fundamentalists who use destruction as a means of imposing a singular worldview over those whom they consider to deviate from it. Commentators try to make sense of this. Why some of today's Muslims are engaging in the same kind of iconoclasm as some of yesterday's Christians during the Protestant Reformation, and how, throughout history, whether in 16th century Protestant Europe or the 21st century Middle East, both Christian and Muslim iconoclasts have used similar reasoning to justify their attacks on images and objects. Both have an absolutist concept of the true God, which denies other types of belief and visual representation. They reduce their interpretation of the true God to a literal reading of Scripture, focusing on the Abrahamic covenant and the story of Moses and the golden calf, a false idol. They detest traditions which deviate from this concept of truth and which express, in their mind, falsehood. And they are willing to destroy the people and the places, both religious and secular, which uphold those traditions. They call them apostates, polytheists, idolaters. This contested landscape becomes even more complex when we consider some of their targets in places like Iraq and Syria. Many of these heritage sites had, in fact, long been neglected. Ancient cities like Palmyra and Nimrud, which declined in wealth and power centuries ago and became depopulated. And just like those ruined churches in Norfolk I talked about earlier, ended up as broken objects in isolated situations until they were discovered by European archaeologies in the 19th and 20th centuries. What you see here is T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, at an excavation on the Turkish-Syrian border, not far from Raqqa, today's self-declared capital of the Islamic State. How to read that landscape and what to do. Many of the statues considered most valuable in these places were removed and shipped to new national museums in London, Paris, and Berlin, designed to furnish the image that those European capitals were projecting about themselves as colonial powers. This is how decisions surrounding broken images and objects become part of building a culture, a cultural mindset. The object falls into ruin. It remains obscure, but in situ. It is then discovered and interpreted and given value. The best of these objects are relocated to places like the British Museum or the Louvre to be preserved and exhibited, while the rest are left in the desert as authentic ruins until the iconoclasts come along and destroy what remains. Indeed, this culture of placing protective value on heritage, so central to the Western Museum, has actually been used by some Islamic iconoclasts to justify their destruction. The case of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan was a notable example. The Taliban detonated these statues as part of a wider campaign against Afghan antiquities. As they did this, the director of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art pleaded to them, "Let us remove the antiquities so that they are in the context of an art museum, where they are cultural objects, works of art, not cult images or idolatry." The Taliban responded by condemning the fact that international museums seem to place value on stone objects while children were dying from the effects of drought, conflict, and economic sanctions. "If you are destroying our future with economic sanctions," one Taliban spokesman said, "then you have no right to protect our heritage." As one expert put it, the fact that money was offered to save the statues transformed them from artifacts into idols, since they were now being venerated more than human lives, and this reverence necessitated their destruction. In other words, to the Islamic iconoclast, the value and the power we place on cultural heritage is in itself seen as a kind of idolatry. So we see that somewhere between the destruction of heritage on one hand and the protection and exhibition of heritage on the other hand is this question of value and who decides, who has the power over what that value means. Just like the iconoclast distinction between the true God and false idols, conservators and museum curators make a distinction between things which are of true value and things which are not. Both are engaged in a struggle over the interpretation of heritage, a shared landscape in which iconoclasts and archaeologists, political leaders and museum curators now find themselves. Let me give you an example of what I mean from the history of the Western Museum. This is a depiction of the Basilica of Saint-Denis in 1793 by the artist Hubert Robert. Today, it is situated in the northern suburbs of Paris. The kings of France had been buried there since the 6th century. With the Revolution, the royal tombs were attacked and the contents emptied, clearing away the symbols of the Ancien Régime to construct a new political system, a republic. Iconoclasm actually became enshrined in French law at this time. However, the new government also sought to protect true art as well as destroy false symbols. While it declared that the values expressed in the images of the pre-revolutionary era were untrue, it ordered committees to ensure that the fine arts would not suffer and created a monuments commission to list and collect those works of art deemed worthy of preservation for the state. Preservation, like destruction, therefore became part of the same organizational process. Having collected valuable works, new national museums were encouraged to house them. The Louvre in Paris and the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Dijon are perfect examples of this phenomenon. Founded in old royal palaces, designed to exhibit the masterpieces of the new republic. So a religious institution like the Chartreuse de Champmeul on the outskirts of Dijon, which was the burial place of the Dukes of Burgundy and housed an important collection of medieval art, was shut down. Much of the building was razed to the ground, but its fine art was transferred to the new museum in Dijon, which you can see here. And in a city like Dijon, like Paris, the fine art in those museums now sits alongside the most valuable artifacts which were transported from archaeological sites in places like Iraq, Syria, and Egypt by Europeans in the 19th century. These are the overlaps I'm trying to outline today. The destruction of things deemed to have false value by iconoclasts, the protection of things deemed to have true value by conservators, the excavation of things by archaeologists, and the exhibition of things by museum curators and town planners. Today, this hybrid of destruction, protection, excavation, and exhibition forms the landscape of the world we have built around us today. In Paris, in New York, in London, and in Rome. If there is a main theme that I would like to draw out this morning, then, it is this, that the question of heritage protection is deeply connected to the political processes of power, because it is through decisions of preservation that the cultural and social landscape is shaped for the rest of us. Organizational decisions must be made about the landscape by local authorities, by city mayors, and by town planners, which, by definition, shape a view of the world for the rest of us. They shape our world view. This is at the heart of what it means to have guardianship. a connection between the power of the image, the power of interpretation, and the power of authority. And as many of you will know from your own personal experience and your elected office, it is a guardianship which carries with it a heavy responsibility. So where does this leave us today? I would like to conclude my talk, if I may, with some very brief thoughts for consideration on how these questions might inform policy making for heritage protection in the future. My first thought is this: there is a need for a continued and concerted change in mindset so that cultural heritage is truly recognized at the heart of political decision-making. Heritage destruction, once regarded as an academic and niche subject, is now front-page news due in part to the actions of Islamic State. No longer can policymakers put the question to one side or think of it as being less important or immediate than their usual concerns of economy and society. As I've argued today, cultural heritage is economy and society. It cannot be separated. To ignore that fact in the present climate would be, frankly, irresponsible. And when we talk of cultural heritage, it is important to remember that we do not refer only to images and objects. We also talk of language, the power of oral history and the written word, of narrative and memory. We talk of cultural heritage as that great ecosystem of ways in which communities interact within themselves and with each other. That is why the Director General of UNESCO, Irana Bokova, has spoken about the link between cultural heritage and what she calls human society. The destruction of heritage, she says, is an attack on humanity because without heritage, there can be no human society. Thus, UNESCO made clear their position on the humanitarian consequences of the Syrian crisis. In Bokova's words, the protection of heritage is inseparable from the protection of human lives. It is a position that draws on the idea that cultural heritage is something universal, common to us all, and that when we lose a part of it, we lose something of the whole. We lose something of our unity in diversity. Which leads me to my second point. The time for this change in mindset needs to be now. These figures represent the increase in number of state of conservation reports issued by UNESCO of both cultural heritage and natural properties. We see a spike during the mid-90s and the Balkan conflicts, and then a steady rise which correlates with an increase in reported cases of destruction by war and civil unrest. Within these figures, 94% apply to the destruction of cultural heritage, mostly in the Middle East. Yet despite these trends, it has to be said that on the state level, there still seems to be an absence of vision or urgency. Too often, cultural heritage is seen by policymakers as a sort of parliamentary luxury, not a priority. I remember some years ago when the UK's Minister of Heritage called his own department the Ministry of Fun. And it is only this year that the UK, my country, introduced legislation to ratify the UNESCO Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. Too often, initiatives are not fully implemented at the state level or not fully respected on the ground. And this has been a problem not just for the protection of heritage abroad, in conflict zones, but also at home. Too often there is a lack of funding for the sector, leading to a situation where many heritage organizations and institutions struggle financially to function. And too often there is a reticence among policymakers to integrate the question of cultural heritage into their wider thinking about civil society and the economy, even though research has demonstrated that the cultural environment has an impact on the health, wealth, and well-being of people and communities. Which brings me to my final thought, the need that we have for leadership in this respect. I believe that we are at present looking at a window of opportunity. Initiatives like UNESCO's Unite for Heritage campaign, the hard work of many national and international organizations, local institutions, and academic experts, some of whom are here today, together with a raised awareness in the media, have created a new momentum in the heritage debate. But there still remains much to do. I would suggest, based on what I've talked about this morning, that while states obviously have a role in terms of intervention and funding in heritage protection, more could still be done to encourage local authorities, local mayors, local organizations, and stakeholders to come together on an international level to share their knowledge and resources about an issue which most of them share in common. Not dissimilar, in fact, to what is being done here today. We know that such an approach has been successful elsewhere in overcoming cases of environmental destruction, for example, and also in tackling the problem of religious radicalization within communities. It is a model based on the premise of local empowerment and international dialogue. And we know that in a city like Mosul, or any city damaged by the effects of sectarianism, such a model is the only way forward if we are to have hope that its heritage can be restored in the future. Who better to lead this forward than city mayors? I am reminded of the words of the past mayor of this city, Mario Primicerio, who said this about the flood of 1966 and the work of the famous mud angels in repairing the damaged fabric of Florence. What we were doing was dictated by the desire to give back the traces of the history of the past to future generations, so that it could be used for the growth of people who perhaps had yet to be born. It was the international community that worked to try to save Florence, this unique patrimony which belonged to the whole world. I can think of no ideal better than that for facing the challenges that lie ahead in rebuilding cities like Aleppo and Mosul. Locals working together in international partnership. The experience of an old city in Italy which shares its knowledge and resources to help an old city in Syria. And what a partnership that would be, where the restored cities of the past can become the restoring cities of the future. Thank you.